Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're here with another special guest here, Mr. Gabe Neville. He created the 8th Virginia Regiment website. He's got some connections to Kentucky in a way, but welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thanks, Jameson. I'm delighted to be here. Doing great.
Thank you. It's a nice day here in Kentucky. Is it pretty nice in Virginia?
Yeah, it's getting cold. It's almost January.
Well,
looking forward to some snow.
Yeah, in Kentucky, the saying, and it's probably pretty similar to Virginia, stick around and the weather will change. I saw a meme the other day that said Kentucky weather does not go by seasons or by months. It's just whatever it is at the moment.
Yeah.
It was pretty much like that. I think last week it went from 50s to 10 below. So
yeah, that one day it was really something.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get too much into our topic. Just background and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
and what maybe even a little bit about the Virginia 8th and how that came about.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'm pretty humble about all this. I mean, I'm just a guy who had a curiosity that turned into a hobby, that turned into an obsession, and now it's turning into a book. Right. So that's how these things go. I've got a very strong interest in the 8th Virginia Regiment for a few different reasons, some of them kind of intellectual, some of them personal. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and it's a regiment of Virginians who mostly came from Pennsylvania. So there's that connection, just like me, right? It's kind of like a big jigsaw puzzle. There was a time, maybe 25 or 30 years ago, I walked into it's now closed, the David Library of the American Revolution. It's there where Washington crossed the Delaware. And I told the librarian, I said, I want to see what you've got on the 8th Virginia Regiment. And he said, well, there's, have at it, and he just let me loose in the library. And I spent a few hours poking around, and I went to him at the end when they were closing, and I said, there doesn't seem to be anything. I didn't find anything. And he said, there is a ton out there. You just have to find it. So that's what I've been doing for 25, 30 years. And believe me, there is a ton. There is a ton, and it's like sports statistics or anything else that you get obsessed with. The more you learn, the more crazy you get about it. And I'm at the point where I'm kind of neglecting my family because I'm writing a book. So that's how bad it's done. These guys, they fought in the Revolutionary War, but they had lives before that and lives after that. And the book I'm writing, it's not about the regiment. It's about the men in the regiment. So I start when they're kids during the French and Indian War and end when they're old men. And I don't know what percentage, but more than half of them are in Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, and that brings us to kind of one of the big topics that I want to talk about. We've been doing on the podcast a segment, just a kind of a ongoing thing about the frontiersmen. And as the listeners know, we've talked about Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, James Harrod, Benjamin Logan, Squire Boone. The list goes on and on of those people that you probably know, especially if you're into Kentucky history a little bit. You probably know those names. If you're not in Kentucky history, if this podcast is all you get from Kentucky history, you probably didn't know some of those people. They were unknown as well. But we had some suggestions about James Knox. and he came up, and he's one of those that's probably more obscure than Benjamin Logan, Squire Boone, some of those other ones, William Whitley, that we've covered, and he was part of the Virginia 8th Regiment. So I got in contact, and I'm not saying you're the expert, but you got a little knowledge about him.
Yeah, well, I like to joke that I'm the world's leading and only expert on the 8th Virginia Regiment. I don't know if that's true about James Knox or not, but he is definitely a neglected figure. And Jameson, you said that if you're from Kentucky, you know those 5 or 6 names that you listed. If you're not from Kentucky, the only one you know is Daniel Boone.
Yeah, that's true.
So all of these guys are neglected, and I like to point out that the Revolutionary War doesn't really seem too approachable for most of us. We think about powdered wigs and slave owning, all the stuff that we don't relate to very well anymore. It's a very different era, but the guys who fought in the war and moved west, those are the guys that we can relate to, right? Those are the guys that built the America that we think of when we think of the American spirit and the frontier spirit. And that's exactly the kind of guys that you're talking about. And that's the kind of guy that James Knox was. So just and why is he forgotten? I mean, there's a few reasons. Some of them might be personal, right? I mean, he might have just been a humble guy, or just not a guy that liked to brag about himself, or maybe he just wasn't that chatty, right? I kind of think that for most people, especially outside of Kentucky, our imaginations only really have room for one of these guys, and that's Daniel Boone, right? And then the other thing is he didn't have any kids. And when it comes to memory and biography and, maintaining records and that kind of stuff, it's the kids that do it, right? They're the ones that want their parents to be remembered. And he didn't have any. So I think that's one reason why he was forgotten.
Yeah, and well, you bring up a good point, with the biography. I mean, Daniel Boone legit had a biography written about him and has had, hundreds more since. And I feel like too, when you hear those stories of Daniel Boone out in the wilderness, a lot of those campfire stories he probably told about things. There's rumors about him wrestling a bear and all that kind of stuff. Those stories were told. If you're, say, James Knox, a humble guy, and doesn't really tell the stories about him coming to Kentucky and so forth before Boone even, those things don't. Who's telling those stories? If they're not being told, no one knows,
Yeah. And of course, only a certain percentage of people even knew how to read and write back then. So, if it wasn't told, it wasn't remembered.
So Knox, like a lot of the Virginia 8th, born in Pennsylvania, came to Virginia. What has his story go? The early part, I guess.
So Knox, there's a longstanding tradition that he came from Northern Ireland, like a lot of these guys, Protestant Northern Ireland, Scotch-Irish, so to speak, by himself when he was 14. So the story goes, as I recall, his parents died, and he and his sisters share the inheritance, and he sold his inheritance to his sisters for money to use to emigrate to America, 14 years old. It appears that the story is not true. There are property records in Augusta County, Virginia, that make it pretty clear that his parents lived there and he was raised there. Now, there are ways to sort of try to make the facts fit the story, but he would have had to have, been adopted by an uncle, with the same name, or something like that. And it seems pretty clear that he was born in the Shenandoah Valley.
Which that valley was pretty I was about to say populated, but it wasn't populated. A popular place for, well, like I said, people from Pennsylvania come to Virginia. And I'm pretty sure Daniel Boone was from Pennsylvania, came to Virginia. I'm thinking Benjamin Logan was not from Pennsylvania right off, but he did come to that Holstein area around in Virginia.
Yeah,
and all
so
that.
the way that worked is Philadelphia was sort of like Ellis Island back then. If you were going to come to America, especially if you were one of these Scotch-Irish guys or Germans from what they called the Palatinate, southwestern Germany, your boat landed either at Philadelphia or one of the ports nearby, like Wilmington, Delaware, and you took what was called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road west. And if you know the geography, it heads west out of Philadelphia. It's now Route 30 in Pennsylvania, through Lancaster and York, and then cuts south into what's in Pennsylvania called the Cumberland Valley, and in Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley. And it keeps on going. It goes down to where Roanoke is now, and that's where the path to the Cumberland Gap goes, and the Wilderness Road. But the Great Wagon Road continues south all the way to Augusta, Georgia. So this is how inland America was populated in the colonial era.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of immigrants in the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah. So whenever he and I meant to say this a little earlier, but we talked about Boone and Boone's popularity and so forth, and we talked about this a while back on one of the shows when we talked about Squire Boone, how similar and parallel they were.
Mm-hmm.
And James Knox and many other of these frontiersmen have this same parallel kind of life, I guess, in a way. They
Mm-hmm.
immigrate to Kentucky. They come through the Cumberland Gap. They have many battles against Native Americans. They go to Lord Dunmore's War, and so forth. James Knox hit all those, or is his a little?
Pretty much, yeah. So
yeah.
There's some stuff we don't know exactly, but it appears that his parents came probably from Northern Ireland. He was born in Augusta County, which at that point was huge. I probably included all of Kentucky at that time. But when he turned 18 or so, he went to the Holston River Valley. He was one of the earliest settlers down there. And then when the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was agreed to, that's the treaty that moved the Indian boundary from the Alleghenies to the Ohio River, right? So that made it legal to go into Kentucky. So he was one of the very first long hunters, and went through the Cumberland Gap apparently several times to explore and hunt, and went on these long hunts where they came back with bales of deer hides. And the history of this is not really well documented, but Lyman Draper, a name that I'm sure he did his best to sort of document, who were the long hunters and when did they go in what sequence. And there are a couple of accounts, including one from Benjamin Logan's daughter, who says that Knox went deep into Kentucky before Daniel Boone. Now that's a pretty controversial thing to say, but Dryman's Draper's a little bit dismissive of it, but he says his reasons are not that solid. He just says, well, if that were true, then Knox would have bragged about it, and he didn't, so it must not be true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I
don't know. That's not good reasoning.
No, and since Knox is one of my guys, I of course think he was the first one, right? So yeah, but he was I don't know that he was ever a surveyor, but you might know about the John Floyd surveying expedition in 1774 when they had to go out and redo Thomas Bullitt's survey, and Knox was along for that. Now, I think he was sort of a scout guide. I don't think he was a surveyor himself, but they went through the Cumberland Gap. No, I think they actually went over the mountains, but they went to Gauley River and then up the New and how do you say it? I always mispronounce it. Kanawha River.
Sounds good enough for me, right?
Yeah, that's West Virginia, so I'm not going to put you on the spot for that one. But and then they went up and surveyed around Louisville, but this was right when Dunmore's War was brewing, and they sort of knew that there were problems, but they didn't realize how bad it was, and they didn't all make it back alive. Neil Hammond, a Kentucky historian, he thinks that Knox actually rescued the first settlers at Harrodsburg and brought them back to
Well,
Virginia.
yeah. Well, so and so there's a book we read and we talked about James, or not James Harrod. Well, we did talk about James Harrod, but John Floyd. And this is one of the few books about John Floyd. We talked about him a few episodes ago, and yeah, Knox was pretty much the lead. John Floyd was in charge, I guess, but Knox was the lead
Mm-hmm.
frontiersman, whatever you want, guide, I guess would probably be the best way to say.
Yeah.
And there was a time at that party, and you bring this up, the Harrodsburg is the party got separated, and then their plan was to meet at Harrodsburg, but then by the time Floyd's group got to Harrodsburg, those people had already left. They'd already left, and it's very well that could have been Knox's group coming in saying, "Hey, we got to get out of here," because the whole Dunmore's War, all that stuff was ruined.
Yeah, Knox had, it's not real clear, but Knox had sort of split off from Floyd, and we don't know why, but there's a diary that one guy kept, and he says that Knox just took off. But it appears that he went to the rendezvous and rescued the Harrodsburg settlers. But I don't think anybody will ever be able to prove exactly what happened there. But after that, he traipsed right back up the Newen Kanawha River valleys again as a scout in Dunmore's War with Andrew Lewis in Christian's battalion. So yeah, he was in Dunmore's War. I don't know if he was at Point Pleasant or not. As a scout, his duties might have been a little bit different than others. But he interestingly, he is listed in the reimbursement records for that service right next to Daniel Boone. So that's pretty good evidence that they knew each other and worked together.
Yeah. Well, see, that's that Dunmore's War. That was the gossip ground of Kentucky. Let's get to Kentucky, because we all went there and was like, man, this place is great. We got to go.
Yeah, and those guys. I mean, there are 5 or 6 future generals that fought in that battle. As some of them just as enlisted men, right? There's a handful of future governors that fought in that. I mean, that was the start of a lot of careers right there.
Yeah. Now, after Lord Dunmore's War, and I might skip ahead a little bit too much, but then Revolutionary War begins. And when I was reading some of the stuff you did, so he fought in South Carolina?
So, yes. So the way this works is in December of 1775, the Virginia Convention, this is the revolutionary government, they authorize several additional regiments. And the way they were formed was each county was given a quota of 1 or 2 companies to raise, and then those companies were assigned to a regiment. But they planned to have a German regiment for all these German immigrants in the Shenandoah Valley. It didn't really work out that way, but this is the Peter Muhlenberg Regiment, namesake of Muhlenberg County. And the colonel was Peter Muhlenberg, and the lieutenant colonel was Abraham Bowman, who that's a last name you should know, if not the first name, brother of John Bowman. And the major was this guy, Peter Helfenstein, who didn't survive. But they raised their 10 companies from 8 counties, all in Western Virginia. And they went south with Major General Charles Lee, who was the second ranking general in the Continental Army, and a jerk, by the way, to stop the British from attacking Charleston. So you may know the story of the Battle of Sullivan's Island in 1776, when William Moultrie, in a half-finished fort made out of sand and palmetto wood, withstood a naval bombardment for an entire day and took out a couple of ships. The 8th Virginia was there for that, but they were not part of that part of the battle. They were on the opposite end of the island, the north end of the island, stopping Charles Cornwallis, who had just come to North America from completing a amphibious landing onto the island to attack the fort from the rear. So that was their first heated military engagement. I don't know if any of them died in the battle, but while they were there, they all got malaria, and and that was bad. So a bunch of them, like 140 of them, were left sick in Charleston when Lee took them even further south to invade Florida, which was a new loyalist colony. They never made it past Sunbury, Georgia, where the rest of them succumbed to malaria, and a very large number of them died. So Knox was part of all that, and they limped back to Virginia, in December.
Well, and whenever I was reading some of this stuff, that South Carolina Revolutionary War always pops up in my mind because of Kings Mountain, Isaac Shelby, and all that kind of stuff. And I was wondering, I didn't know, the story of the 8th, and I didn't really know if that connected to, Isaac Shelby. And all
no
that
connection
stuff.
with those guys. Francis Marion, who's a famous South Carolinian, he was at the Battle of Sullivan's
Swamp
Island.
Fox. Or
exactly.
Swamp.
But now the 8th never went back. Now some of them individually went back later in future service, but not as part of the 8th Virginia.
Gotcha. So once all that concludes for Knox, he's one of the survivors of all that. Then he heads back to Kentucky, correct?
Well, no, not yet. So after South Carolina, they limp back to Virginia, and they're given a short furlough, and then they head to join George Washington in New Jersey for the 1777 campaign. And when they get there, Washington decides to form an elite rifle corps, which is now very famous. This is Morgan's Rifles, Daniel Morgan. And I don't know whether it had 10 companies like most regiments did or not, but Knox was picked to lead one of the companies. He needed a new job because all but a handful of his guys had either died of malaria or deserted, which is maybe something we should pause to talk about just for a second. So Knox was the only captain in the 8th who didn't complete his enlistment quota at the beginning. And then when they left for South Carolina, a whole bunch of his men deserted. But there's a reason for this, right? So at that time, they were not Continental soldiers. They were Virginia soldiers.
That's right.
It was the 8th Virginia Provincial Regiment. Their job was to defend Virginia, right? And so when Lee took them out of the colony, I think a lot of them very rightly and justifiably said, this is not what we signed up for. And quit. Right? So, and then the ones who went south, a whole bunch of them got sick with malaria and died. So by the time Knox is in New Jersey in the spring of 77, he's got just a handful of guys left. A full company would have had 68 men, and he's down to, I forget the number, but it's like a dozen. So, and some of them are sick, right? So, he gets pulled out and put in charge of a company in Morgan's Rifles, and of course they go north with Daniel Morgan and are at the battles of Saratoga, which is the turns the tide of the war, right? I mean, this is when they capture John Burgoyne, prove to the French that they actually can win battles. So Knox is part of that. It's big stuff. So, and then after that, they return to Washington and rejoin with him at Valley Forge. There's the Battle of White Marsh. You don't hear a whole lot about right before that. Then I'm not, at some point in 1778, he is released as what they called supernumerary. They had too many officers.
Okay.
So they consolidated the Virginia line. Like the 8th Virginia was folded into the 4th Virginia. And Knox was supernumerary, so he was discharged. He was briefly appointed to lead a Virginia, another what would have previously been called a provincial regiment, now a state regiment. A little bit like George Rogers Clark's Illinois regiment.
Gotcha.
My impression is that it didn't really. Virginia decided they didn't need it after all, or it didn't quite come together. And then his military service was done.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And well, that's, I mean, I don't know. We talk about a lot of the frontiersmen, and they all have some sort of military career, and not that it doesn't continue in the form of, on the frontier and so forth, in an extent, but still, I mean, he's a significant and or participated in quite a few different little battles that, during the Revolutionary War that are very, very important.
Indeed.
More so than, well, I was going to say more so than, say, some of the other people in the frontier, but a lot of people just don't realize, the Battle of Blue Licks and the sieges on the forts and those kind of things that happened during the Revolutionary War in Kentucky as well. So once his career, and this, you might not know the answer. How old is he by this time?
Well, I don't know that we know for sure when he was born. I think the date that you usually hear is about 1740. I want to double check that, but that would make him 30 something.
Yeah. So, but again, like you said earlier, he doesn't have any kids at this point. He's not married. But once he leaves the military, then he finally comes to Kentucky, right?
Yeah. So he had been to Kentucky, as you know, a couple times as a long hunter. On one of those trips, he claimed some land. As you know, if you piled up a bunch of logs and called it a cabin and planted some corn, you could claim that as your homestead. And he had done that. He went back after Dunmore's war with John Floyd briefly in 1775 and had some land. And soldiers got land for their service in the Revolution. Officers got a lot of land for their service in the Revolution. So yeah, he went back. He led at least one train of settlers to Kentucky. Apparently went back and forth, did that a couple of times at least, and had landed a lot of different places. But it's not. I don't have a lot of information on how much he engaged in the Indian wars that were going on in this period, but I've got to believe he was involved to some extent. Doesn't seem to be well documented if he was. But he was friends, maybe best friends with Benjamin Logan. And then he was also involved with the creation of the Kentucky state government. He was a member of the House, a member of the Senate. And one of the more important things he did was in 1794, I think, he was in charge of widening the Wilderness Road so it could accommodate wagons. And that, if my geography reminds me, if I remember my geography right, that runs right through Knox County, Kentucky, which people think is named after General Knox, Henry Knox, the artillery general. I may be partial, but I'm pretty sure it's named after James Knox. And there is an early source that says, it's not a government source, but some memoir, I can't remember who it is, but he says, it's not named after Henry Knox, it's named after James Knox. And it would make sense.
Well, that's what I was about to say. A lot of the things I've read say Henry Knox, of course, but that would make sense because, like, during the formation of a lot of the counties and that early stages of government, they literally, it looked like they looked around the room and said, "You're the governor, Isaac Shelby, Shelby County. Benjamin Logan, you were here too, Logan County." And literally were pointing out people that were in the room making these decisions. And he was, I talked, we've talked before about John Floyd. John Floyd seems like he's always around. He's always in. But there was, like, we joked on an episode saying there was not really a book about John Floyd. Well, there are books about John Floyd, but then the next person in line, like I read Benjamin Logan's biography, reading John Floyd's biography. You know who's always popping in those? James Knox. He's
Yeah.
always in there, but there's no, it's always interesting when you find that character or that person that was involved in it all. You just don't know as much about them because it's just not as well documented. But he was there. You mentioned the Floyd um, expedition again. Whenever Floyd again did a bunch of surveying, and as people would have heard on the previous episodes about Floyd, Floyd pretty much was the man on surveying. Like what Floyd said, just about went. If you had a survey done by Floyd, that one held account, which is again what got Boone in a bunch of trouble and all that kind of stuff too. But yeah, James Knox was right in the thick of it with all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, from start to finish.
Yep.
Just didn't quite make the cut for a biography.
That's right. Yeah.
And the sad thing, Jameson, is that there was a period after which people's memories were gone because people died, right? So if people didn't tell your story within a few years of you dying, it's pretty much lost. Now, we live in an age where the internet makes it possible to aggregate lots of small data points that which you couldn't do decades ago. So some of this history can be revived, but it's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like lots of little data points from lots of different sources, and you kind of put them together until you think you've got the whole story, or as much as can be reassembled. And that's what has to be done with James Knox.
Yeah, and it's very true. And Benjamin Logan, obviously, being growing up around Stanford and all that kind of stuff, is always one of my top frontiersmen, if you want to say it that way. Of course, I'm being biased, but James Knox was very much a big part of his life, and even after Benjamin Logan passed away in 1801, I believe, James Knox was still involved in his family.
Yeah, so Knox had never married, and when Logan passed away, I think after 2, might be 3 years, Knox married his widow, Anne, I think was her name, and they were married for 20 years or something. And there's a bluff overlooking the Bullskin in Shelby County where all 3 of them are buried, basically, all next to each other. It's kind of sweet. The cemetery's been abandoned a few times over the centuries now, but right now it's in great shape. There's a Shelby County cemetery group that has done just a phenomenal job restoring it, and it still takes a little bit of effort to get to. It's not right off the road, but it's a beautiful spot.
Well, and for those, did Knox, like I know, so Benjamin Logan moved to Shelby County later on when he was running for governor and that kind of stuff. Did Knox move there too? Do we know like where his area of living was compared to others?
Yeah, so this is something I need to figure out. I don't. The honest answer is I don't know, Jameson. He and you can't go from his property because he had plots of land all over the Commonwealth. So one of the guys with the cemetery group was his opinion was that he's actually not even buried there by the marker. Because he owned property somewhere else. Now, if he was married to Anne and she's buried there, then that would seem to indicate that he probably is buried there. But that's something that I'm hoping to figure out.
Anything else about Knox that you want to bring up? I mean, we talked about. I mean, we've scaled his life pretty much with what we know, for the most part. Again, the Benjamin Logan aspect of it is always interesting to me. But anything else?
Yeah, I guess I just underscore that he represents the forgotten people of history, right? We have heroes from every period and every event, but they are never the only ones who lived through those experiences. And for every Daniel Boone, there's a James Knox who did pretty much all the same stuff, but just doesn't get remembered or celebrated the same way. And, of course, some of the stuff we learned about Daniel Boone conversely isn't even true, right? So, you've always got to remember that some of the stuff we know we shouldn't know, and some of the stuff that we don't know we should know. So history's complicated.
Very, very much so. Very much. Anything about the seventh, or not seventh, the eighth Virginia Regiment, and just like how connected they are with Kentucky, or anything else you want to bring up about that as well?
Yeah. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, a very large percentage of them went to Kentucky after the war. As you know, veterans got land in Kentucky and then later in Ohio for their service. And these guys in particular were already westward facing when the war began, because they were from the Shenandoah Valley and the Virginia frontier. Yeah. So, just looking at my notes here, some of the other veterans of the 8th Virginia Regiment who were of note in Kentucky are Robert Breckinridge, who started as a sergeant in Knox's company in 1776. He went on to ratify the U.S. Constitution as a delegate from Kentucky. He was the first Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. He was a brigadier general in the Kentucky militia in 1792, and then a major general in 1794. And he's buried right next to John Floyd in a little cemetery maybe you've been to in Louisville. I think Breckinridge and Floyd were buddies, just like Logan and Knox were.
Knox, yeah.
And then a guy named John Stevenson. He was a real important militia leader from Pittsburgh, which was claimed by Virginia at the time of the Revolution. Indian fighter, captain in the 8th Virginia Regiment. He's buried outside of Cynthiana, and his house is still there. It's been renovated.
Cool.
A nice couple that lives in it. Abraham Bowman, his brother, of course, was John Bowman, who was more famous in Kentucky than Abraham. But Abraham Bowman led 30 families from the Shenandoah Valley to Bowman Station in 1779. His brother was there too. He probably fought at the Battle of Blue Licks. His name is carved into the monument without any fanfare. It makes it look like he was just a private, even though he was the colonel of the 8th Virginia Regiment. Right? And his one really neat thing is that his original settler log cabin is still standing. It's in the back of one of these ritzy horse farms outside of Lexington. But I got permission to go see it, and it has also been very nicely restored. And if you think of log cabins as the mobile homes or the trailers of the colonial era, his is a double wide. It's 2 stories and it's got a basement, which log cabins have. Yeah. So that's pretty cool. And Bowman's son studied law with Henry Clay. His grandson, John Bryan Bowman, was the founder of the University of Kentucky.
There you go.
And then there's a guy named George Slaughter, who was another captain. He served with George Rogers Clark in the Illinois Regiment. And he was one of the original trustees of Louisville. He was the commander of Fort Nelson there at Louisville for a while. Jonathan Clark, who was George Rogers Clark's big brother, the oldest one, he was 8th Virginia captain. He's buried at Cave Hill, and his house is still standing in Louisville.
Real quick, you brought up the Slaughter, George Slaughter. Does he have a son named Gabriel Slaughter by chance, or does you know of any?
I think that's a nephew.
Different nephew. Okay, all right. Which he was, I joke all the time. Kentucky really missed out on having a Slaughter County, and they did not name. Why they skipped over him and didn't name a county after Gabriel Slaughter, I don't know, but missed out on an opportunity.
Yeah, I know the name, and I remember looking up to see how they were related, and I'm not sure I remember exactly, but I think he's probably a nephew. I'm pretty sure he's not a son. Yeah.
Gotcha.
There were a bunch of slaughters, and they're from Culpeper, Virginia. And then one of the big ones is just about any school kid around Louisville knows this name, William Cron. He was the man who built Locust Grove.
Okay.
People often say Crowan or Croghan, or it's pronounced all sorts of ways, but it's apparently appropriately pronounced Cron. But he was George Rogers Clark's brother-in-law. His sister was a Clark. And of course, his house is still standing there. They've got a great museum there. Very important guy, also buried at Cave Hill. And then one story that I want to tell, that'll be in my book when it's published, is the story of Peter Muhlenberg, who was the original colonel, finished the war as a major general, and he oversaw the land lottery at Fort Nelson in 1784. So when they first started handing out all this land for veterans, at the very beginning, it was a lottery, but you had to show up for the lottery. And of course, this was in the middle of the woods, basically. Yeah. It was very hard to get to, and they were scared of Indian attacks. And it actually didn't go all that well because they had to send the surveyors out after they'd done the lottery, and people didn't want to go. But it's quite a story. He kept a diary of the entire trip. So he floated down the Ohio from Pittsburgh. And then after it was over, he traveled through Crab Orchard and the Cumberland Gap to get home. And there's a lot of pretty crazy detail about, dead bodies laying by the side of the trail.
Oh,
it's really something. It's an amazing story. One of the best parts of it is on his way there, he stops in a small town in Pennsylvania, just before he gets to Pittsburgh. And he's a big deal, right? He's a major general. He has an important role in Pennsylvania government. He was the de facto governor for a while. But he's headed out west to do his duty here. But he doesn't want people to know who he is because he doesn't want to talk politics, right? So he's sort of incognito, and he's sitting in this tavern, and they're all talking about him. They're all talking politics. and he doesn't identify himself. And he laughs about that in his diary. But so that's a good story too. But yeah, so these guys, a whole bunch of them went west to Kentucky and later Ohio, and then further west. Some of them went as far as Missouri before the generation passed. I'm working on a book on the 8th Virginia. Look for it in a couple years. And I have a website, 8thvirginia.com. Where there's a whole bunch of material. I've got soldier rosters, some short biographies of these guys, a couple pieces on James Knox. People can submit the names of their ancestor if they want me to post them, which I do. I've got a YouTube channel that's just got a handful of videos on it. I'm not as prolific as you are, Jameson. And I write stuff for the Journal of the American Revolution and some other outlets. So spent a lot of time working on this, and really delighted to join you today.
Hey, well, it's been a lot of good information, and it's one of those things. I really like it when we're able to find out about somebody who nobody knows, nobody has any idea. I could walk the streets of Crab Orchard or Lexington or anywhere in the state probably, but hey, the frontiersmen, the long hunter James Knox. And people aren't going to know, but in this way, with what you're doing, hopefully we can get some people to realize the importance of some of these people that the history books have just left aside in many cases. And like I said before, James Knox is one of those. When you start reading these biographies of these frontiersmen, he's always popping up in them. His role may be minor in one, maybe larger in the other. But he definitely deserves just as much credit, and a lot of those Virginia 8th Regiment people as well that they did the same things. They did a lot of the same things as Boone and Kenton and all those. It just maybe at a different time, different point, or maybe people just didn't write about them or tell the stories.
Yeah. Well, like that librarian at the David Library 30 years ago, the information's out there. You just got to dig.
Yeah.
So, thanks for this program. You're reviving the memories of a lot of people that would otherwise be forgotten. So thanks for doing it.
And thanks for doing your stuff as well. Like I told you before, it's not too often that I stumble upon somebody, I start reading their stuff, and I think, man, this person would be great if I could get them on the podcast. And then the next day, we're recording the podcast. So, you are a fantastic guest.
Well, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, and I think you said it all. You said it already before. You're on most of the social media things. Just look up Virginia 8th. You got a website. Reach out that way. If when the book comes out, come back on and we'll talk about the book as well. The invitation is open. So
well, thanks a ton. Yeah, I've got I should plug my Facebook page too. I've got a rolling calendar of content, so there's something up there every day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
okay.
I don't know what the address is. Facebook.com/8th Virginia probably, but you can link to it from 8thvirginia.com.
Yeah, and of course I'll share some stuff on that on our page as well, so we can so people can find it easier. Well, thanks again for joining us. Anything else before we go?
No, just thanks to you. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Well, thanks you all. Thanks again for coming on, and thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.